Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation. I'll actually be delivering this talk next week in PEI, but I thought I would record it here for anyone who might be interested. I'll be talking about the Mathilde Carrière-Nault collection, which is housed at the St. Boniface Museum. It belonged to my great-grandmother, Mathilde Carrière, and that's her in the photo, and next to her is her husband, Alexandre Nault. I'm not going to talk about the appearance of the artifacts, the techniques used to make them, or their features. Instead, I'm going to talk about the story behind the artifacts and how these objects can be used to teach about the experiences of the Métis family during the Northwest Resistance and how they actually connect two resistances, the Northwest Resistance and the Red River Resistance. Mathilde came from a family that left Red River in the 1870s, and after the Northwest Resistance, she returned to Manitoba where she married Alexandre Nault, whose father had been involved in the Red River Resistance. So those are some of the things I'll be covering today. Usually when Métis artifacts or other Indigenous artifacts were collected by museums in the 1800s or 1900s, it was done in a bid to salvage what were deemed vanishing cultures. These artifacts were seen as representing peoples and ways of life that were supposedly going to be pushed aside by the inevitable march of civilization. They were cataloged in an ethnographic way, which usually meant that the names of the makers or owners were not recorded, or only minimal information of that kind was written down. Displays often highlighted the beauty of the designs or craftsmanship of the artifacts, but the stories behind them were not retained or seen as particularly important. In researching this project, I was inspired by wampum belts. They're not the same as Métis beadwork, of course, but wampum belts were used and are still used by the Haudenosaunee, for example, as memory aids for talking about the past, such as treaties signed decades or even centuries before. The idea that an object could carry historical memory in this way led me to wonder whether Métis beadwork might function similarly. That question brought me to Igor Kopitov's research on the cultural biography of things, which examined how the meaning of objects can change over time depending on who owned them and where they were kept. I also found the work of Julia Sonnleitner very useful. She studied objects from former Yugoslavia that survived war and displacement and discusses how objects can become biographic when stories, losses, relationships, and turning points become attached to them. These are the ideas I was thinking about when researching this project, and they shape how I'm approaching this collection. The collection is not a large one, it just consists of a beaded wall pouch and a pillowcase. That's Chris Poot on the right, a descendant of Mathilde and Alexandre like me, discussing the pillowcase during Louis Riel Day in 2025 on CTV. Sharon Blady has done some research on the pillowcase, writing an MA thesis and a book chapter focused on its appearance, the techniques used, and the origin of those techniques. There is also some minimal information in a French language book chapter on Mathilde Carrière that touches on her family and the pillowcase. And on the St. Boniface Museum website, there is additional material, though not a lot. They suggest the pouch may have come from One Arrow Reserve in Saskatchewan, near the village where Mathilde spent her childhood. Here's what the collection looks like. I first saw the pillowcase in the 1980s on a school trip during Festival du Voyageur in Winnipeg. It was displayed in a room with many other objects from the 1800s and 1900s, presented as an example of a pioneer or Franco-Manitoban family. Nothing was said to connect it specifically to Métis people. I did notice the name Mathilde Carrière-Nault and thought, I wonder if I'm related to this person. Years later, I discovered that she was my great-grandmother, so I had no idea at the time, but it's interesting that I first encountered the object in high school. Mathilde was born in 1877 to Damas Carrière and Marie Pélagie Parenteau. We don't know a great deal about her, but I was fortunate to interview her granddaughter, Dolores Poot, who recently turned 90 and lives not far from where Mathilde and Alexandra did in Winnipeg. Dolores described Mathilde as a very humorous person who liked to play pranks and make jokes. She described Mathilde as playful, but also stoic and reserved. Mathilde never spoke about her childhood or what happened to her family during the Northwest Resistance. There were very traumatic events she witnessed and endured, which I'll discuss shortly, but she kept those to herself. She rarely opened up about her feelings, even regarding her health. She had stomach cancer and died suddenly in 1940. Mathilde was born in Batoche, but spent her early childhood in the neighboring village of Saint-Laurent-de-Grandin. On the right, you can see where the family lived, not far from the ferry you can take from the Duck Lake side of the river today. Her family was a well-known buffalo hunting family, and her most famous relative was her granduncle, Gabriel Dumont. Mathilde's grandmother was Gabriel's sister, and her name was Marie Pélagie Dumont Parenteau. Her great-grandparents, Isidore Icapau Dumont and his wife Louise Laframboise, along with her grandmother Marie Pélagie Dumont and Gabriel Dumont and other relatives, all survived the Battle of Grand Coteau in 1851 in Dakota Territory, in which 100 Métis fended off something like 2,000 Sioux warriors. This is Damas Carrière on the right, Mathilde's father. He was among the Métis who signed Gabriel Dumont's petition in 1882, which was sent to Ottawa over concerns about Métis land rights. Ottawa did not respond, and that led to great frustration and anger among the Métis. Damas traveled to St. Boniface in 1883 to attend Louis Riel's sister's wedding, and it was there that he and his friend Napoleon Nault spoke to Riel about Métis land grievances and other issues. Riel later came to the Saskatchewan Valley and led the Northwest Resistance. Damas, along with Mathilde's grandfather Jean-Baptiste Parenteau and granduncle Gabriel Dumont, served in Riel's provisional government. Damas actually had a close relationship with Riel. In fact, just before his execution in 1885, Riel had a vision in which he renamed the planets and constellations, and he wrote down that he would like to rename the morning star or Venus Damas Carrière after his friend. Mathilde had many women in her family to draw inspiration from. Her grandmother, Marie Pélagie Dumont, Gabriel's sister, famously declared upon hearing that the Northwest Mounted Police were on their way to Batoche, "Let them come, I'll spear them like the buffalo." She has been described as a heroine of the resistance by Lawrence Barkwell. Her great-aunt, Marguerite Caron, was the woman who urged Riel to send reinforcements to Turin's Coulee, which is also known as Fish Creek, during the battle that occurred there. Madeleine Dumont, another great-aunt and Gabriel's wife, was recorded as cooking and caring for the wounded during the Battle of Batoche. All these women showed remarkable courage in 1885. They demonstrated loyalty and risked their lives in support of Riel and the Métis cause. The men in Mathilde's family likewise showed great courage. Her uncle Jean-Baptiste Parenteau Jr. fought at Duck Lake and at Turin's Coulee, where he was wounded. Her uncles Isidore Dumont Jr. and Auguste Laframboise were both killed at Duck Lake. Gabriel Dumont distinguished himself throughout the resistance. He was wounded at Duck Lake, but survived and rallied the Métis to victory there. Other uncles, Jean-Baptiste Montour and Saint-Pierre Parenteau, were killed at Duck Lake and Turin's Coulee, respectively. Mathilde's family experienced grave losses during the Northwest Resistance, the greatest loss being her father. He was among the final Métis defenders who were trying to protect the community at the Battle of Batoche. In the end, there were about 60 men left, and they were fighting with stones, nails, and melted pieces of metal for ammunition. He was one of those final men. He was killed on the last day of the battle when Canadian soldiers captured him and cruelly dragged him behind a horse to his death. Mathilde's grandparents also had their home looted. It's recorded that when her grandmother pleaded with the soldiers to stop looting, they mocked her and cynically threw one of Jean-Baptiste's shirts at her. The shirt was all the family had left. The soldiers stole their grain reserves, burned the house to the ground, and took everything, including some cash that was left on the premises. Other family members had their houses burned down as well, or were wounded, or had their belongings seized, or were driven into exile. Many, like Gabriel Dumont, ended up in Montana. Riel himself chose to surrender rather than flee. After the Northwest Resistance, Mathilde and her 3 siblings were sent to live with their uncle Adolphe in Manitoba. Adolphe was very young at the time, about 18, and Mathilde's mother remarried a man named Maxime Dubois, another resistance fighter, and she remained in Saskatchewan with her new family. All the siblings eventually returned to Saskatchewan except Mathilde, who stayed in Manitoba. The beadwork appears to have been a keepsake given to Mathilde by her mother to remember her by. Mathilde married Alexandre Renault in 1893 at the age of 17 and spent the rest of her life in Manitoba. Maxime Dubois, seen in the photo with Mathilde's mother, also appears in the famous group photograph of Métis prisoners taken in front of the Regina jail. He was among the die-hard Riel loyalists, like Mathilde's father, Damas. In marrying Alexandre Renault, Mathilde brought the beadwork collection with her to Manitoba. Originally, Damas and his wife left Red River because of the Reign of Terror that followed Manitoba's entry into Confederation. In 1885, the Métis once again were attacked and displaced, and Mathilde ended up back in Red River, now named Winnipeg, where Damas had been born in St. Vital. Damas had actually grown up on a river lot beside that of André Nault, Alexandre's father, so the Carrière and Nault families lived side by side for many, many years. Mathilde and Alexandre lived on the same lot as Alexandre's father, around what is today Pembina Highway and University Crescent in Winnipeg. I lived across from there as a university student. I had no idea at the time, and I used to go to the river sometimes and look across at Riel House, not knowing I was standing on my ancestors' land. This is a photo from the diamond wedding anniversary of André Nault and Anastasie Landry, held on the river lot. It's exactly where I used to stand as a university student. If you look closely in the center, you can see Mathilde and Alexandre in the crowd. André Nault took part in the first act of resistance at Red River and remained active throughout that struggle. He was Riel's captain and first cousin. And so these 2 objects that belong to Mathilde, the beadwork collection, therefore connect family members involved in both the Red River Resistance and the Northwest Resistance. So they are symbolic of the broader story of the Métis Nation and the families at its core. This brings me back to the conceptual frame I introduced earlier. Sherry Farrell-Rassette's work is important here because she argues that Métis decorative arts should not be treated simply as aesthetic objects. They are tied closely to women's labor, to family life, mobility, and historical change. This perspective helps us understand the Carrière-Nault collection as something more than floral design or visually appealing folk art. Kopytov's cultural biography of things asks us to trace an object through the different contexts in which it accumulates meaning. These 2 pieces were not always museum artifacts. They were tied to families who were displaced during the Northwest Resistance and to a community in Red River during an earlier
struggle. Sonnleitner's work similarly shows how objects can outlast war and upheaval and gain new significance as they are passed among families and eventually make their way to a museum like these artifacts did. What I'm trying to do here is recover the historical memories linked to the artifacts that belong to Mathilde's family, who lived through the Northwest Resistance. Well, not all of them lived through, but she survived the resistance along with her siblings and her mother. And also to link it to another family that helped shape the Red River Resistance, the family of André Nault and his son Alexandre Nault. I would not say that these objects can produce reconciliation on their own, but they can support reconciliation-focused teaching when presented with fuller historical context. Museums have been called upon by the TRC's calls to action to review their practices regarding Indigenous peoples, and many are doing so. Object-based learning offers a valuable framework here. By engaging with pieces like these, students can interpret the past, develop their own historical understanding, and see how a small collection can help them learn about Métis history, Manitoban history, and Canadian history. It's interesting that in that photo there you can see a sash worn by Aimable Nault, who was André Nault's father and Alexandre Nault's grandfather. So there are many other stories that remain to be told through the museum's collections, and I hope we can reframe objects like the Mathilde Carrière-Nault collection so that they can help us move further along the road to reconciliation with Métis and other Indigenous peoples. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the email address shown on the slide, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions about the collection, the family, or Métis history in general. Thank you very much. And these are the sources I used for my presentation. Thank you very much.